Get ready to kick back and enjoy some quality you time. Welcome to the Do You podcast. How did you end up from there in Nebraska or wherever the hell you ended up doing your tour to Liverpool?
Well, I mean, Liverpool, I have a very personal relationship with the city of Liverpool for 10 years now. I've been going there for 10 years, you know?
Mm.
And when I arrived there, as you get older, things start making sense. At that time when we arrived, even though I was a massive Beatles fan and I wanted to go in there and start seeing how everything worked out, we ended up there by accident because we were actually going to Sweden for a tour, and that was one of our stopovers, and our luggage got stuck or lost. Our guitars were 1 day behind or 2 days behind, and so we stayed in Liverpool extra longer, and we met some people there, and then our gear never came until like a week later, and we had to keep going to their shows. But we met family there, and when I say family, people that just took us in and got us shows and gigs, and that's just been my relationship with that city. I really owe them my career, to be sincere with you, because before Liverpool launched me around the world. Really? And as silly as it sounds, because we played the Cavern, that opened up our door. That would open up our door to Japan, because of Japan, we were able to get into Australia, and because of that, we were able to get into other parts of Europe. But before that, nobody wanted us. So if it wasn't for Liverpool, I would not have a sustainable musical career, to be sincere with you.
Wow. Well,
I owe that city beyond, man.
And you met Pete Best there too, right? The former drummer for
up to one of my little
the
adventures
Beatles.
there, and so now I became family with those people.
Yeah. Now, what was your role with the Beatles Museum out there in Liverpool?
The Beatles stuff, okay. So what was told to me, I got this lesson early on with the people from the Cavern, and they said, Christopher, it's okay to diddle around with the Beatles stuff, but you want to be very careful not, and I want to say the name of the gentleman, Mr. John Keats, was the director of the Cavern. He goes, look, you're not a Beatles cover band. It's good that you do a few Beatles songs here and there, but you got to be very careful how you play with the fabric of the Beatle thing, because it's so easy to get sucked into that world, and then you'll never come out of that, because everybody will always associate you with a Beatle thing.
Yeah.
So for me, it's always been, with the museum, I'm a curator of exhibits, curator of history, historical, things that have things to do with the Beatles that not everybody necessarily knows, or people that were associated with them prior to them making it, not already after making it.
I should have ran this by you before, so if we need to cut it out, we will. But what's the real story behind Pete Best and Ringo?
Well, I am in liberty to speak about that. So, working for the Best family in the Casbah. A little bit background on the Best family. So, basically, when the Beatles first started, they weren't the Beatles. They were called the Quarrymen, and they had the Moondogs and all these other names. They would come to the Casbah. The Casbah was a big house that was purchased by Mona Best. She actually gambled all her jewelry and made enough money to buy that house, believe it or not, put all of her life savings into this horse called Never Say Die. And with that money, she bought this gigantic mansion in a really high-end area of Liverpool. And even her husband laughed at her because he goes, oh, you're never going to buy a house. She's like, watch. That's going to be my house, she said. And she saw that house. She bet all her stuff and bought that house. And eventually she wanted to set up like an area for kids to come and make music, because at that time there was only jazz and different clubs like that, right? So she opened up this rock and roll club, coffee shop, that's what we're going to call it. And all the kids from around the neighborhood would come over and want to play and set up. And John, Paul, and George started painting the place, and she'd let them play because they paint it, kind of just assistant.
Oh, no kidding.
Yep, and that's how that got started. And eventually the Beatles needed a drummer to go to Germany, and they also needed a bass player. So my passion is actually with Stuart Sutcliffe, which is the original bass player of the Beatles. That's always been my I
didn't know they had
my favorite Beatle. Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah. So Stuart was the original bassist. Without Stuart, they wouldn't have never wore leather jackets. They would have never wore, the sunglasses or the cool vibe in that era,
Yeah.
they would have never gotten the name the Beatles because he gave them that name. They would have never had the styling. He was their stylist and their early booking agent. So eventually they ended up going to the Casbah. They knew that Mona had a son to play drums, and then they knew they needed a drummer. They didn't like Pete because Pete had a lot of chicks. He always had the best pull on the chicks. He was a really good looking guy. I said, yeah, I mean, the guy worked out in that era. He was a boxer,
Right.
So you can imagine he was very well fit. He's still very well fit up to this era in his life. And so he ends up,
Is he married?
yeah, same lady that he's had since the Beatle days.
Okay.
Beautiful, beautiful lady. And so they end up going out to Germany. They played all these different shows. They came, they killed it in Germany. That's where they became a great rock and roll band. And then they came back to Liverpool. The mother put together a bunch of different concerts for them. Then the mother became their manager. The mother bought them their van. The mother gave them money for funding for the equipment. And eventually down the road, Brian Epstein came into the picture. He wanted the Beatles really bad. So he told Mona, well, I want them. And Mona said, okay, you can have the boys and I'll sign over the contract to you, but you got to get them a record deal. So Brian went and got them a record deal. He went all over the place trying to get them a record deal with EMI and Capitol and all these different places. So basically, Brian started seeing how much control Mona had of the Beatles. So he wanted her out. And the only way to kick her out was to kick her out and Pete. But Pete was actually handling a lot of the books and contracts. And this is not just stuff I'm saying. I've seen the paperwork. As a curator, I get to read a lot of this stuff. And every time I'm sitting in there going through papers and stuff, I find new stuff that just goes, whoa. And I literally come by, I go, hey, how come people don't know about this? Well, we're in liberty to release certain stuff. Some stuff we're not,
Right.
And like I said, the stuff I'm allowed to say is just to continue with that story. There was a contract. And the screwed up part about this is, all the Beatles were brought in to sign this record. At the Casbah, they brought in the original contract. Okay. And it said, basically we sign over the Beatles to Brian Epstein Enterprises, NEMES, which was his company at the time. And they all signed. Okay. The next day, Brian Epstein did the same exact meeting with the other three remaining Beatles, separately without Pete, on a separate management deal, besides the contract that he had already signed.
Oh, jeez.
So there was two living contracts, okay, two existing contracts. So basically, Pete was still a member of the Beatles in this contract, so he had to rub him off somehow. The day of the recordings of the first recordings, George Martin had said, Pete can stay in the band. And you can see the stuff online. Pete can stay in the band. I never said he had to be kicked out. He's just not apt to where recording is. And if you're on the other side as a producer and engineer, we need to get the stuff done. I don't have time to sit this guy and teach him how to record in the studio. I got to get those recordings done because I have deadlines that have to get turned into the label. That's just what that is. So it wasn't a personal thing. He just said he's just not going to pick it up. They tried it in the audition. He just did not make the cut.
Yeah.
And they brought in a professional studio guy, and the Beach Boys did the same thing. Dennis never played on any of the albums. He played live.
Yeah.
It was the same exact deal, identical deal.
Bernard Purdie was one of the drummers that sat in for the Beatles as well.
I've heard that. I don't know what song it would have been, but
it was a few of them actually. I think it was off of Revolver.
Interesting.
But at Berklee College of Music, same type of idea. We were down in we had a drummer's row. It was just as we were in the lower floors of the building, and I just walked by a room, and there's Bernard Purdie with a room full of kids
teaching him stuff.
He just plays and talks at the same time.
Yeah,
really amazing. But he had mentioned,
playing with them
and on records, and wasn't able to.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've seen some interviews there, and the ending of that, like I said, they're sitting in there, and the day before. Or I think it was either the day before or the day of the recording, Brian sent them a message to Pete and said, hey, Pete, we'd like you to come in here to the office before you report to Abbey Road to record with the boys. So he showed up. The boys were already at the session with Andy White. Okay?
That's the drummer?
Yeah, the studio drummer that was playing on the tracks. And is there Andy or Alan White? I think it's Andy. Either way, there they are with the new drummer. He's not joining him. He's just on the recording session.
Yeah. Right.
And Brian's sitting there grim looking at Pete. He goes, well, this is going to be very difficult, Pete. There's no easier way to say this, but the boys want you out. If you accept, here is the paperwork. You know, you can resign today, and I have other bands, if you're interested, that I can probably place you to start working in. Because Brian saw that he couldn't throw away this guy either, because he was very good looking. He had talent, and he was good, you know, but he don't want to just let go of talent. Brian was a very smart man. So he wanted, for Brian to invest money and make another band based on Pete Best immediately, what is that telling you?
This is just, I don't know.
He wasn't bad. Why would you invest all this money into another human being that you just kicked out of the Beatles? If he was terrible, you wouldn't have a nice day. Here's your check.
I see what you're saying,
have a great freaking life. He still managed Pete for a while longer.
And Pete ended up developing his own career and having his own
Well,
thing.
that's a different story. I mean, so now you got to understand, you know, so now, you know, looking at the legal term now, because we've had attorneys look at that legal document. And when you're looking at that contract, when you're reading the different lines on it, I just said the word to you and I read it to you verbatim. The boys want you out if you accept. What does that mean if you accept? It's an option. He had an option. He could have said, no, I am not leaving the Beatles.
Oh,
but he was so young, he didn't know this. He didn't have an attorney with him. You know?
So he was signed, but he kind of gave it up unwittingly.
Basically, unknowingly.
Right.
Yeah, so he signed the damn paper. But if he would have just waited 24 hours, which I always tell people, wait 24 hours before signing anything, unless they're throwing cash in hand in you, wait 24 hours. Have somebody professional look at it. And if they can't wait for you for that, everything can wait. I mean, come on.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And the whole world will change. If he would have waited 24 hours, he would have brought that contract back to the mom, because the mom was such a badass. She would have had that contract seen by an attorney, and everything would have been different.
Yeah.
But because it wasn't, he signed himself away from the Beatles. So the Beatles didn't kick him out. He kicked himself out without knowing he kicked himself out. But he had rights. It's kind of like stocks. The stocks can't sell themselves. You got to return them. And he returned his own stock.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's how that ended up. And then Ringo came into the session that same day, you know, and Ringo wasn't allowed to play. Ringo doesn't play on that album, on the first album. It's still and Andy White.
No kidding.
So there you go.
Well, I'm your host, Mike Byron. Until next time, buckle up, keep your hands on the wheel, and remember to do you.